So today I'm going to be speaking about business models. I've spent about close to 2 decades of my career working with scientists and engineers and understanding how ideas are translated from the research lab to the market. These processes are highly uncertain, and it takes, especially for science ventures, quite a long period of time. Let me begin by sharing some research that we published in Nature Nanotechnology, where we studied the commercialization of a science-based university spinoff. Very early pre-formation, we have number of patents being filed. Intellectual property is the currency for science-based ventures. It is this currency that allows the raising of multiple rounds of venture funding. As postdocs, grad students, academic researchers, and PIs, many of us, probably all of us, are familiar with raising funding, though for scientific purposes, with granting agencies, with their own rigors and their peer review systems. And yet, as these ideas are getting translated to the market and moving forward to a market application, we now are engaging in trying to translate our ideas to an audience which may not fully appreciate every scientific nuance. And thus, while we have to convey the credibility of our technology, we also have to make sure that it is understandable to an audience not trained in the same domains. Through this process, which takes several years pre-formation, and even after the venture has been formed, it takes several years before small biotechnology startups can start building partnerships with much larger pharmaceutical companies like Amgen, Pfizer, AstraZeneca, and Merck. In this way, we see the long timelines, the high levels of scientific uncertainty, which are continually being reduced, the changes in processes that work in the lab. When you increase the scale at which you're operating, you've got to change the manufacturing processes. All of this goes to convey that it is a long, complex process. So the question we have is, why do it? And why does your organization exist when you form a venture? What is the purpose behind the creation of your organization? It is questions like these that are central to business models. Ask yourself, if you were wildly successful with your venture, how would the world have changed in 5 years or more? And often when we speak to scientist entrepreneurs, the answer is not that they want to become rich. The answer often is like this. Behind every successful platform is a champion, or champions who had a great desire to get products to patients and were practically willing to walk through walls to do so. In this statement, there is also an understanding that often the large companies are not licensing in technologies from research labs early on. They wait for these small ventures to get formed and wait for these ventures to de-risk the technologies over long periods of time, struggling to raise funding. And only when the technologies have been sufficiently de-risked do they come forward to either acquire the venture or license the rights, as the case may be. So we see that central to business models and central to this phenomena of university spin-off emergence, where we need business models, central to this phenomena is the university research lab, the scientist entrepreneur, and the lab members. In research we published last year, we found that technology market matching is a key component of this process. Early on, pre-formation, many scientist entrepreneurs can start matching the technologies that they are developing to market application. And why do they need to do this so early? It is because doing this early enough allows the creation of evidence that can be understood by investors, that can be understood by experienced executives who you would want to have on your founding teams. An example of technology market matching can be seen. Many times these technologies are platform technologies, technologies like controlled release, which can have applications using micro and nanoparticles, microchips, mucosal drug delivery, aerosol drug delivery. And in this case, we see from the lab of Bob Langer that how 10 companies were formed over 1987 to 2011. Multiple companies formed to address many different applications of a fundamentally underlying concept, which is controlled release. Now, of course, one of the things that I should also mention is that I speak of these technologies from the perspective of a business researcher and not as a scientist. And here we see 30 different companies started by the Bob Langer lab, by Bob Langer as an academic co-founder. We see many different platform technologies being used to start multiple ventures targeting many different disease indications over time. In this way, one can argue that these startups, these university spin-offs, are experiments in themselves. They are ways to link the science being done in the lab to market applications. And by market applications, the end result is trying to find applications which will improve society or will have social impact, which will improve the lives of patients and their caregivers. When we look at founding team composition, we often see the PI, the lead academic researcher, taking the role of the director or on the scientific advisory board or both. This is in the science-based venture that is being formed. When we think of science and business coming together to take such ideas forward from the research lab to the market, we see lab alumni many times joining on in as the scientific officer or as a scientist. We see experienced business professionals with a background in venture capital, with a background working with large pharmaceutical companies, or having serial entrepreneurial experience themselves, having started multiple ventures themselves, taking on the role of president, chairman, or CEO. In this way, there's an integration or combination of both the science from the research lab and the business acumen that is needed when raising financing, when working with regulators, and bringing in specific skill sets that might be useful for addressing markets, certain jurisdictions, as well as regulatory affairs. So all this to show, again, that science commercialization has higher levels of uncertainty, takes longer periods of time, is often linked to academic research from university research labs and needs business involvement to take their ideas forward, or business acumen to support the translation of these ideas. Now, defining a business model. Business models describe how organizations function to achieve their goals. Now, these goals may be social impact, these goals may be profit, but there's a variety of goals that can work through a framework like a business model. It can also be considered an activity system geared towards total value creation for all parties. As we'll see in the next set of slides, nanomedicine, biotechnology commercialization, science commercialization often relies on many partners with many different interests. And it becomes necessary for a nascent or emerging science-based venture to understand not only the science, but the interests of their partners, and to work in a manner that creates value not only for themselves, but also for their partners. So let us look now at the business model canvas. The business model canvas consists of 9 cells. We have the right side on your screen, which looks at the customer segments, the relationship with customers, the value propositions, the channels, and then your key partners towards the left. How will you work? What are the resources you'll have? What are the key activities that your venture will focus on? What's the cost structure that you will incur? And again, if we look back to our first slide, we noticed that for many, many years, we have costs more than revenues. So early on in the life of science-based ventures, and particularly nanomedicine or biotech ventures, often the costs are higher than the revenues coming in. And so there is always constant pressure to raise additional rounds of funding. To raise that kind of funding, you need to show progress, which is often shown in the form of additional patents filed and granted, additional papers published in leading journals as evidence of the scientific excellence of the team. Progress can also be shown by having experienced members join the team and the strength of the team to take the commercialization forward. All of this leading to revenue streams of various types: fee for service, upfront payments, milestone payments, royalties, and various ways in which partnerships can be set up with each partner to facilitate the generation of revenues specific to each subsector of biotechnology and nanomedicine. So now let's look more closely at what does a science-based ventures business model look like? How can we be more specific? So for customer segments, you could have users. There could be multiple possible markets and segments. Remember the platform figure that we looked at earlier. For the same underlying technology or concept, there can be multiple embodiments. There can be multiple ways in which you work with different partners for different geographies, using licensing of intellectual property by fields of use, and thus segmenting the market. And I'll be showing you examples to explain these points further. When you look at customer relationships, various customer segments might have different arrangements with the science-based venture in terms of co-creation, of new knowledge, or whether there is automated ways in which knowledge is shared with them. In terms of channels, a science-based venture sometimes may choose to have its own sales force if it is far enough along the value chain to reach a stage where it has got regulatory approvals and is in the process of setting up and using its own sales force. And we'll see that in an example. And of course, in case ventures don't want to have their own sales force, they can rely on other distribution networks. In terms of value propositions, given the complexity of nanomedicine and the ways in which evidence has to be developed and shared and communicated to various audiences, there are many stakeholders or groups interested in the value propositions or why a certain therapeutic or a medical device. Is it better than the current standard of care? Does it provide value to the patients? So regulators are interested, prescribers or physicians are interested in the value propositions. Payers like health agencies, like insurers, like employer groups, like hospital groups are all interested whether the technology being developed is economical, is viable, it meets their cost revenue frameworks. And often that can be a challenge. In terms of key activities for science-based ventures, it's often R&D, exploratory work in partnerships, integrating technologies from acquisitions from time to time. Key resources often are patents, having an experienced team, having access or managing rare equipment. The key partners, as I said, often emerge and start with the linkages to universities and university research labs, because most often that's where these ideas originate. And thus the university, the tech transfer offices are our primary partners. Additional different kinds of investors, both angels, VCs, and other types of investors, grant and funding agencies, large pharmaceuticals, CROs, patient advocacy groups, and nonprofits all play a role and all can be key partners depending on the sector you are in, depending on the kind of technology that you're taking forward. The cost structure, of course, there are development and prototyping costs. There can be facilities costs, equipment costs. What we've noticed in many instances, and this is linked to our paper on strategic timing, which I started this presentation with. Often it is a strategy followed by science-based ventures that they delay their formation until the technology is much more commercially viable. In doing so, they are relying on the university system providing a pipeline of highly trained, skilled set of researchers to work on collaborative research projects to take these ideas forward. They rely on being incubated in university settings, which is often essential when there are high levels of uncertainty involved. An additional point here is that many investors have timeframes which are generally not as closely aligned to the timelines of science-based ventures. So often it can take 7 to 10 years or more for some of these technologies to reach the market. And yet many investors cannot wait for 10 years. Their timelines are close to 3 to 5 years, sometimes 7 years. And so it is useful to consider the possibility of delaying formation so that by the time you form your venture, you have in effect a pipeline of good news in the terms of additional patents that you're waiting to get issued, additional publications that are in the pipeline to get published, and additional evidence, all of which allows you to go back to investors and ask for additional rounds of funding. Very rarely would investors give you all the money you need the first time you ask them. They are going to be giving you small amounts of money. They will look for evidence of progress, and the patents, papers, and addition to and building an executive team or an experienced team is what they often look at in terms of progress. All of this leads to different kinds of revenue streams. Again, there are potentially long timelines to revenue. You could have fee for service, you could have sub-licensing, upfront royalty milestones, many different ways in which revenues can be generated for science-based ventures. Looking closely at the value proposition. The reason why a customer chooses your product or service, and this is over the competition. So you have to understand the competition. You have to understand the competitors' offerings. What are they providing to your target customers? And how are you better? How is your product better? What are the product features that are better than competition? Is your product faster? Is your product lower cost? Is your product offering a new feature that is not yet offered on the market? All of these are ways in which you can try to convince customers to choose your product or service. Key to value propositions are questions like, which of our customers' problems do we solve? So for that, you have to understand the customers. You have to understand what are the key problems that they face. And then your technology should hopefully be able to help them solve the problems that they face. What is the value that we deliver to the customer? All of these are questions that are important when considering value propositions linked to the different customers that you've identified for your product or your service. Some other questions to consider when thinking about business models. What will the startup need to operate? You'll need cash. You'll need to have a team in place. You'll need lab space. You need access to equipment and consumables. What will be the cost of development be, and what will be the development timeline like? And again, I emphasize operating in partnership with university labs or incubation spaces, so that by the time you incorporate or form the venture, many of these questions you have answers, or you're close to getting to an answer on many of these questions. How will the startup attract customers and partners? Why would they be interested in you? How will you build credibility to work with customers and partners? Often a challenge, especially in more risk-averse environments like the one that we operate in. Many partners and entities are more comfortable working with established players and established partners. And often a new startup has to face a liability of newness. How do we convince someone to work with you when there is less of a track record? And again, that's where the link to an academic lab, to the work of a PI or a set of PIs and publications and patents, all of that come into play. What will be the product price and why? And this again is in relation to competitors' offerings. It's in relation to your own development costs, and we'll see later. How and when will customers and partners pay for the product or service? Will they pay upfront? Will they pay milestones? Will they pay royalties, or a combination of these specific to each partnership? Would you plan to develop manufacturing facilities yourself, or would you have partnerships to get the manufacturing in place? These are, again, some questions, and there are more. Now let us start looking at some examples of what we've been discussing. So let us look at the case of a company called Pharmaceuticals. It was an MIT spinoff. Biopharmaceutical company focused on discovery, development, and commercialization of innovative therapies for diseases of the eye. They have 2 marketed products which have passed various levels of regulatory approvals. They have a proprietary mucus penetrating particle to address unmet needs in dry eye disease and post-ocular surgery. They have a pipeline of multiple proprietary NCE development programs targeted to address various front and back diseases of the eye. They hold worldwide rights and IP on all marketed products and pipelines. So as we see, it looks like what they've done is they've managed to do a lot of research within the academic lab, formed the venture, raised multiple rounds of venture financing, millions of dollars, went on to have their IPO, which is an initial public offering, and used all that financing to have a sort of a go it alone strategy to market, where they have maintained control and rights to all the products that they have developed, and they are marketing it and using their own sales force. And this indicates that, though unusual, such a strategy is sometimes possible. Let us look at another example closer home, AbCellera. And AbCellera's done a phenomenal job in antibody discovery and generation, and have been fundamentally involved in the development of a COVID therapeutic. And now let's look at how they work. Their model is built on partnership with drug developers. They work both with large pharmaceutical companies to small biotechnology companies. And what do they offer? Our product to our partners is data. Data on the composition of matter, composition of antibodies and their properties. They enter into contracts which allow us the rights to use the data. And the data that is generated is used to further refine their machine learning algorithms, which are a central part of their offering. Why should customers choose them? Why should their partners, the large pharma companies, the small biotech companies, choose them? Because, as they say, we empower them to move quickly, so faster, reduce cost, and tackle the toughest problems in drug development. They use the word intractable. So we see 3 things. Working with AbCellera, many of these partners are able to move faster at a lower cost, targeting problems which are often difficult to target using other techniques. How do they generate revenues? They generate revenues through payments for technology access, performance of research, downstream payments, royalties on net sales, and of course, all of this varies by partner, and as their technology, as their offering, as their platform becomes more and more robust, they can take higher levels of risk and design partnerships which allow for more long-term or downstream payments. Let's look at another company called Moderna. again, their technology is based on an mRNA technology platform. They've raised over 2 billion US dollars and are working on more than 21 different drug indications. They've worked with a variety of partners: AstraZeneca, Merck, DARPA, Vertex, and the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. So they have partnerships, and Harvard Spinoff, and they speak about that model as being very reliant on digitization to ensure seamless integration across the ecosystem, enabling the ability to share and access data, permitting the scaling up capabilities to satisfy ever-increasing demands for research mRNA for preclinical and GLP toxicology studies, as well as GMP mRNA. So again, we now are seeing this integration between, or say digitization between biotech companies working now with informatics or information sciences. Let's look at another company out of Toronto from the U of T. Interface Biologics is a privately held commercial stage company developing transformative biomedical polymer products. Its surface modification additives are used in FDA cleared medical devices, clinically proven to reduce infection and thrombus-related complications. In 2010, they signed a definitive license and supply agreement whereby a large company, Fresenius Medical Care, was offered an exclusive worldwide license to apply their technology to various components of their dialysis circuits for treating end-stage renal disease. Fresenius is the world's largest integrated provider of products and services for individuals undergoing dialysis because of chronic kidney failure. So you see the importance of this partnership and this license, which led them to generate revenues and remain privately held while having started off from an academic research lab at the U of T. In 2020, they sold their surface modification business to Evonik, another large global chemical manufacturer, and now have created a new company called Ripple Therapeutics, which is founded on a discovery that drugs can be engineered into controlled release pharmaceuticals and medical device coatings without the use of polymers or excipients. Thus we see how at times certain biomedical companies are able to go it alone, and others raise multiple rounds of financing, all of it driven by very nuanced considerations of their business models and aspects of their business models, specifically targeting their partnership agreements to meet the needs of their clients, their customer segments. Let's look at digital business models or digital medicine business models. Digital medicine business models can also be quite complex. So the products could be therapeutic, they could be diagnostic, there could be screening or monitoring or analysis and patient engagement aspects. The technology itself could be point of care device or a home health device. It could be an implantable or a wearable. It could be injectable. It could be on the phone, phone accessory. It could be an environmental sensor, and so on. The users could be physicians, could be the payer, could be a provider, could be a patient, could be a regulator, could be a researcher or a pharma company. It could be targeted at segments who are healthy consumers or those who are interested in being labeled self-quantifiers. The economic model could be reimbursed prescription. It could be fee for service. It could be self-pay. The model could be based on data aggregation, which is of interest to certain regulators or health authorities at times. The platform could be sub-licensed. There could be feature upgrade fees. There could be data archiving service. All this to show that there's lots of decisions and lots of nuances in science-based ventures around business models, which have to be thought of very carefully. Now let's look at some examples of real world learning on business models. Now this is based off of interviews and reports of 101 startups who didn't make it and what their founding teams, members of their founding teams had to say. So what are the reasons why some of these ventures could be interesting for us? So when we look at some of the responses we got, many times ventures fail because there is no market need. A lot of technologies are developed, but yet when you approach the market, people are not interested. They ran out of cash, did not have the right team, got outcompeted. There were pricing and cost issues. The user was not friendly, or the user didn't understand the product was not designed according to their needs, the product did not have a clear business model, it wasn't marketed properly, the customers weren't really addressed, or their needs weren't addressed. Now let's look at some of the ways in which some quotes from founders whose startups or ventures haven't succeeded. The cost of providing the program exceeds what our customers can pay for it. So fundamental challenge. It's not possible to deliver at even break-even cost. The lithium metal technology worked for products like drones, but the big money in the battery world is in the automotive sector. Investors weren't willing to sink the money needed to develop the battery for electric vehicles. So a mismatch between investor expectations and focusing on too niche a market where you would not have been able to generate sufficient revenues to survive. In retrospect, if we had a senior finance person and a senior ops person, it would have been a completely different story. Speaks to the team, key resources, business model canvas. I realized essentially that we had no customers because no one was really interested in the model we were pitching. Doctors want more patients, not an efficient office. So I was discussing this with someone and they said, well, there must be some who want an efficient office, and of course there will be, and yet that's probably not enough to sustain that as a focus. So the pitch had to be different, the product probably had to be tweaked. So these are sort of some of the real life examples of the challenges when customer focus, when customer inputs, when understanding their problems has not been at the forefront of technology development and science commercialization. Another example, consider the example of a startup developing an inexpensive module that will improve the resolution of existing MRI scanners. So existing MRI scanners being sold by another entity or another firm, and a startup has a technology that will improve the resolution of these scanners. Should be an easy sell, and yet it is not. The challenge could be radiologists may love the technology, but may refuse to buy it simply because installing an addition like this would invalidate the manufacturer's warranty. This is not something one should do with a $1 million complex instrument. And it is issues like these which would have been evident had early stage discussions with customers taken place and not having gone through a lot of technology development before starting to reach out to customers. Another example from a slightly different industry. This is a seafood business model. Master students who came up with a question: what if you could design a financial incentive for good management practices? Conservation-minded tourists paying higher prices for local lobsters in exchange for harvesting practices that would ensure a fishery's sustainability. Local fishermen could profit while lowering harvesting pressure. Sounds like a great idea. They started a venture, launched as a wholesale operation, selling responsibly sourced seafood to restaurants. Ran into a problem. Too few conservation-minded chefs in high-volume restaurants could not scale. There were very few chefs, or too few chefs, who were able to go through this and support it as customers. And so what did this business do? They moved to a retail model and started selling directly to consumers, and the business is working. So you change the model, you change the way, you change the customer segment that you're working with. Fundamentally, the idea has legs. It's just trying to find a way to reach the customers differently or a different set of customers. Now, we've talked about startups as having these business model challenges, and yet business model challenges can also happen even for the largest, most storied companies. Philips started in the lighting industry, and yet over the past decade, it has shifted from originally a hardware company to providing solutions that consist of systems, software, and services, predominantly in the healthcare and the health tech domain, where they say, we even go to different business models, with Philips taking co-accountability for health outcomes, which is, again, something that's becoming more and more important in North America and across the world, really. With Philips taking co-accountability for health outcomes, the patient experience, and improving productivity in healthcare. All of this to say, business models enable science-based ventures to create and capture value. And business models can be refined over time. And as an instructor, I see great value when participants in programs like the Eye2Eye come back to me and say, working through these ideas, I've realized the value of my own idea. Thank you.
Thank you very much, John. Well, John, I'll jump in because this was a fascinating presentation. I think we could have heard you speak for a couple of hours today. I really enjoyed the piece about learning from the failure of others. I have found it to be a lot less painless than learning from my own failures, which I do try to do. But these failures that you've identified, a lot of it could be almost summed up as you're falling in love with the science and you've developed a solution to a problem you're not sure is actually branded as somebody's real problem. So what is the advice that you give people early enough along that they can, I wouldn't call it fail fast, but that they can do a self-assessment that's realistic about this fantastic scientific innovation or new discovery that they've published on and protected in relation to a completely different context, and that is getting it to market where you are assured and confident that there's a paying customer at the end of the day. What kind of advice do you give them, and at what stage? I mean, I was fascinated by that slide you showed, your second slide. It was a 40-year journey from that Nature Science publication to where we are today. So how do you scroll backwards and say, what is it that people who are successful ask themselves, and what boundaries and tests do they apply that prevent them from investing 40 years in something that will never have a customer?
Yes, thank you for an excellent question, Diana. It's really close to my heart, and that's the reason why, as a business researcher, I've spent so many years working with scientists and engineers to see some of their ideas come to fruition. And yes, it does take such a long time. And of course, I really liked your use of the term a paying customer at the end. And of course, that is central to understanding the customer and their ability to pay. And of course, in the case of biotechnology, biomedicine, really, there is this nuance that the person using it or benefiting from the service may not be the actual payer. It might be the insurance company or an employer group or a health authority or a government. Mm-hmm. And so one has to craft one's value proposition to address these many different segments. There are cases where the technology is perfect, and yet an integrated technology required radiologists and physicians to work together for the administration of a drug, and thus it led to differences in the way these communities work. They have traditionally been a bit more siloed, and if a drug comes along, which is an integrated kind of a particle, which asks or requires radiologists to be in the same room with the physicians while the drug is being administered, it can lead to its own challenges of commercialization. All this to say that science commercialization has really long timelines, and some of the scientists that we've studied over long periods of time, they've tried to look at technology market matching very early on, even in the product or the project formulation stage. The reason is this. The reason is, as the projects progress in the research lab, and the PI and the grad students, the postdocs, come together and decide, well, we want to form a venture, you're now looking to get investors interested. And investors are interested in the science, but they are also equally and probably more interested in the market application. And so if you've spent a decade on the science but are just starting to think about the market applications, then the market part of the story could need more work. And so the earlier you start thinking about potential applications and choosing which application to prioritize, can make the difference in early access to financing. And of course, given the sectors that we are interested in and are really excited about, these are difficult to get off the ground without investors' support.
Right.
And so it gets back to that question. To get to the customer, you need to do more work. To need to do more work, you need more funding. To need more funding, the idea has to meet their bars of evidence and credibility. So the scientific credibility is already there, but the link to the market has to be demonstrated before it can go further. Otherwise, you sort of get into a situation where you get a few translational grants, and it takes you about a year or two into the process, and then things start drying up. For the Canadian ecosystem more broadly, what that tends to do at times is then great ideas, great ventures have to move where the financing is more munificent. And this leads them to move south of the border or to other parts of the country.
Yeah, thank you very much. Marshall, do we have any additional questions or comments?
Yes, we do. We have a raised hand and a written question. I'll start with the written question, which reads, the slide on reasons for failure are fascinating. I was wondering at its core, why do ventures run into these issues? Is it a lack of experience and not recognizing a lack of market need for the product, not having the right team members in place, etc.?
So yes, I would sort of think of it both as a technology development issue as to when they started the venture, how far were they along that technology development process in that decision. Our paper in Nature Nanotechnology 2017 with Professor Alicia Main and I, we look at the strategic timing of venture formation. So when you have created all of that evidence to meet investor interest, that is part of the story. And that is the reason why I included the slide on the founding team, where we had the science and the business experience coming together. In many times, there are scientists very, very interested in staying at the lab bench, and they are comfortable handing over the technology to another team to take the commercialization forward. And there are others, scientists, who want to be keenly involved in every aspect of the commercialization process. And often early founding teams need market experience, people who understand regulatory processes, the intellectual property nuances, the licensing aspects, and all of that plays a role. So if you don't have the proper founding team with the right backgrounds, the best ideas will get stuck if you don't have the right team in place. And therefore, often VCs look really closely at the team, more so sometimes than the technology.
Okay, very good. Next, we have Leah Greystone, who's raised her hand. So I'll invite you to speak. Leah, go ahead.
Great, thank you, Marshall. And thank you, Dr. Thomas, for such a great presentation. Would you be able to talk a bit more about how to apply a business model concept if you're running a research lab or institution specifically, rather than a venture?
Well, and that sort of gets back to that controlled release figure that I showed from the lab of Bob Langer. There are times when the technologies that are being developed in research labs are platform in nature, and they are termed platform technologies, and they can have multiple market applications across different segments of the industry targeting different disease indications. And what better evidence of a platform than the lipid nanoparticle therapy from the lab of Professor Peter Cullis. And of course, there are so many different applications to that, and it's been so fundamental in the development of the Pfizer BioNTech vaccine. And so it's often a decision that PIs and their grad students, postdocs have to take around how to prioritize and choose which ideas to give more attention to. And this is a difficult decision to take, and is often driven by granting agency and funding body mandates. But overall, the idea is that if you can have technology market matching and this prioritization being done in the research lab at the time of project formulation, it can serve you well when you get to the stage of talking to investors, and of course leading to having a chance for a well-endowed startup.
Well, I note it's 1 o'clock Eastern, so thank you very much, Dr. Thomas, for an extremely informative webinar. And to our participants, thank you for joining today.